Okay, without further ado, Eli and Michelle, you're both ready. I can kick it off from my end. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon, and thank you so much for joining today's session. And for the ones that are joining from the West Coast, obviously, good morning still to you. We're excited to be hosting our fourth session around the topic of the FCC changes that will go into effect in 2025 and the implications towards the customer acquisition industry. Initially, this session was not planned. This session really came about by all the content that was produced by all the attendees in the previous three sessions. We had close to or over 100 questions that were raised during the session. And then in addition, we got quite a few questions that were also sent to us per email. And a lot of those questions were really awesome materials to talk about. So we wanted to make sure that we had a chance to address those. And for that, we'll go through a bunch of questions. But again, we want to make it as interactive as possible. So please do use the chat function. We're going to shift through the questions. We're going to try to address as much as possible today to go through it. Before I introduce everyone to Eli, before that, I wanted to do a real quick high intro on what we're going to address today, which questions we're going to address. We placed them in a couple of different themes. There's been a lot of questions around the definition of ATDS and when is brand explicit consent actually applicable, and when are these new changes applicable? So we'll definitely spend about 15 or 20 minutes around the definition, the alternative, overall just express written consent, and all the good stuff around that before we go into some more questions around the flows, how we see that we perceive most companies to be implementing brand explicit consent. And from there, we'll do a little bit actually of a segue towards different products that advertisers and publishers are running today in the industry to make sure that we can actually not only focus on leads, but also a couple of other product items that there were questions about. And last but not least, we want to talk about impact, where we think we're going to be in maybe 18 or 24 months from now. So that's how we categorized it, but feel free to add any other questions that you feel are a good fit. Let me kick it off to Eli. Eli is the Chief Strategy Officer at Verisk Marketing Services, and he will run us through a quick recap of the last three sessions as well.
Awesome. Thanks, Bas. Well, I think you captured it well in terms of the categories of questions we want to dive into today. We did our best to kind of take all of the questions that came in from the first three webinar series, and as Bas mentioned, we got I think over 100 from each of those, and started to kind of group them into themes and areas that would be useful for everyone to hear answers on. I think we declined to answer some of those live in the last couple of sessions. We tried to cover the ones we could, but there are a few that go deeper than Bas or my direct expertise. We're not attorneys, and we don't play attorneys on TV either. So thought it would be most productive for everyone if we would ask Michelle to come back and join us here for another round and help kind of provide some expert view on a lot of the questions that are kind of technical in nature as they relate to the regulation and how to think about different dynamics there. So maybe Michelle, if you want to get us going with just a brief overview first for everyone on, or a refresher really on what the regulation is and what the changes are that are coming, and then we can dive right into some of those questions around the specifics of an ATDS that I'll bring us back to as soon as you give kind of the briefer for everyone.
I think that everybody in this industry is probably sick of hearing one-to-one and logically and topically. Those words are things that have probably been repeated over the last 6 months more than they were ever and all the time before that. So, the reason that we're here is that the FCC announced, as it's colloquially become known as, the fact that they wanted to close the lead generation loophole. And basically what they were referring to is marketing sites that had purported consent for hundreds, in some cases thousands, of marketing partners by a consumer filling out one lead form. And so in doing that, they went pretty drastically to the other side and went from being able to get consent from multiple sellers, multiple brands in one form to only allowing, and we'll talk about some exceptions to that, but really only allowing one-to-one consent, one consumer to one seller for consent And the type of consent is prior express written consent. And you need prior express written consent, which we'll call PEWC, the initials, that's it for short, PEWC, for two specific types of calls. Calls that are using an automatic telephone dialing system, which we're going to get into, or calls that are being sent using a pre-recorded or artificial voice. And so what the FCC said in this order is that for those types of calls, for those types of marketing calls, you're required to get one-to-one consent, and it must come from a web page that is logically and topically related to the purpose for which the consumer is giving the consent. And so that's what's brought us here today. There's been a lot of questions that have been raised about the specifics of this, and obviously what effect this is going to have on brands, on sellers, on lead generators, and hopefully we can ferret through all those questions today.
Excellent. Thanks for summarizing to kick us off. So one question first to clarify, because we had a few different, I think, angles to this question come in over the course of the series. First of all, can you just clarify for everyone what the start date is of when you have to be compliant? It's in January of 2025. Is there a specific date?
Yeah, I think it's January 25th. I saw the 27th on some materials that we had out there, but I'm pretty sure it's January 25th. But regardless, I would just say by the beginning of 2025, you should be compliant with these regulations. And really, to be compliant with these regulations, if you're going to use an ATDS or a pre-recorded message, you really need to start now, because it's going to require that you get consent that meets those requirements. And then before making phone calls, once the effective date starts in January, you'll have to have proof of that consent to use a ATDS or a pre-recorded message.
And I think that's a really important distinction that we make sure we clarify for everyone. So starting on that date in January of 2025, any call you're placing or use of a pre-recorded message or a text you're sending, that you have to have consent that meets these new requirements for that specific call, right? So if you've collected leads prior to January of 2025, right, like leads you're collecting right now that might have express written consent but don't have one-to-one consent associated to them, starting on that date in January of 2025, you can no longer rely on the older consent that you had, which was compliant for calls placed prior to that date, but then becomes no longer valid or useful at that point forward. Is that the right way to frame it or think about the distinction?
This isn't something that starting on the effective date that you'll be able to continue to make calls unless you've generated leads that are in compliance with these requirements.
Okay. So I think that's a good one to clarify, and would encourage folks in the audience to speak up if you have questions or drop them in the comments, because I know there were a few trying to understand that dynamic. A lot of our industry utilizes consent for some time period and holds it as valid, and it continues to dial or call on aged leads even. So important to make sure you're starting fresh, starting on that date with your consent gathering practices. Another,
I use the word calls, but the FCC was very clear in this order that the requirements for calls also apply to texts. And I would also say, we're not really talking about this today, but the other area where things have become very difficult to get calls through and to have effective telemarketing calls is that we have carriers that are restricting the ability for calls to get through. Now, we're not going to touch on that during this call, but for calls, and especially for texts that are required to become registered with the campaign registry, if you don't have consent for those types of things, you will see the carriers blocking those at a much higher rate lately.
Let's dive into that in a second, a little bit more in detail, Michelle. Before we go there, I do think it's so clear how you outlaid, or how you're relaying out actually the fact that it's pre-recorded messages and ATDS. I think a pre-recorded message pretty much speaks for itself. I don't know if you want to define that from your side, but maybe it's good to dive in a little bit about what's the definition of an ATDS, because that's been a topic for a few years at this point of time already, right?
It sure has. It's been a topic that we've been involved in for quite a while now. So just to be very specific, the TCPA prohibits making telemarketing calls using an artificial or pre-recorded voice. And so if you are going to be using AI, that's an artificial voice, that's also included within this category of calls that need prior express written consent. Pre-recorded message, I think, is pretty obvious. They do say the pre-recorded message requirements also apply to text messages. I guess you could send a voice to text message that would fall under that as well. I think that's the only scenario where it would really apply. But we're talking about those specific types of technology for the pre-recorded artificial voice. For automatic telephone dialing system, we've been litigating this issue since 2012, really, when the FCC removed the existing business relationship exemption from the ability to use a ATDS to call to telemarket individuals. And so, there was lots of litigation around what constituted an ATDS. I mean, the definition seems pretty straightforward. It's using a technology that has the capacity to randomly or sequentially generate telephone numbers and then either store those or dial those. So that's basically what the definition is. The FCC mucked it up quite a bit, though, in 2015 when they released an order that basically said that any type of modern dialing equipment, so basically anything that wasn't a rotary dialing phone, because it has a computer attached to it, has the ability to randomly and sequentially generate numbers to store those or to dial those telephone numbers. And so that led to the huge increase of TCPA litigation we saw after 2015. The case made it to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court looked at that definition of ATDS, and they clarified that what the definition actually means, and I'm not going to go into all the semantics of it, but basically you have to actually be using a random sequential number generator to generate those telephone numbers, and then to automatically dial those numbers. And so, we all know in the industry, no one's out there, at least no one I'm aware of, is out there randomly, sequentially generating telephone numbers and just dialing those. And so really now under Facebook, and I obviously always recommend that people talk to their attorney, get a dialer opinion that something is not an ATDS. And I'm not providing legal advice today. We always have to make that disclaimer. But if you are dialing from a pre-populated list, and you're using a predictive dialer that is dialing those phone numbers without human intervention, which we're going to talk a little bit more about with some new legislation that's been introduced, then you're probably not using an ATDS. So dialing from the list is pretty safe. The pre-recorded message AI, that's apparent. If you're using those, you're going to know.
So a lot of questions and follow-up questions, and actually throughout the session were about that, because as I see, one of the questions that was actually phrased as, Michelle mentioned that ATDS was previously defined as anything but a rotary phone or sequential dialer. Is that still the case, or has that been changed? What is the current definition? So I think you just answered that question. It is the current definition as how it stands currently, correct?
After Facebook. So after Facebook, that got rid of that horrible 2015 order that the FCC released. So that is no longer the case. You don't have to get your rotary dials out. You can use your predictive dialers for the most part. I would caution, though, that there are a handful of states that have more restrictive laws, and the way that they're more restrictive than the TCPA is that they use definitions that talk about the automatic selection or dialing of telephone numbers. And so, a predictive dialer, in theory, would automatically select when's the best time to make a telephone call, and then would automatically dial it for an agent that would be available then to take that call when it's connected. So, Florida had a very restricted definition. It's less restrictive, but I'm telling you, you should still use caution in Florida. The plaintiffs' attorneys are still bringing those lawsuits. Also, Maryland, Oklahoma, Connecticut, those are all states that have those definitions that could bring in a predictive dialer to an ATDS.
Mm-hmm. And before we go a little bit into the alternatives, which is seemingly manual dialing, which I think there's a lot of talks around manual dialing today. You mentioned there is legislation that's being proposed currently. Are you referring to that with the Do Not Disturb Act, or other legislation as well that could be impactful? And maybe you can actually touch base on what the potential changes that's coming up on that.
Yeah, so let's just start with the Do Not Disturb Act. The Do Not Disturb Act was introduced by Representative Pallone, who is the ranking member of the House Energy and Commerce Committee, which is the committee that generally looks at these issues around telemarketing, and has been very active, for instance, in getting the Trace Act passed. Senator Pallone, Representative Pallone was one of the congressmen that introduced the Trace Act. So we have, raised the risk level a little bit higher because it's him that has introduced this, and he has had success in the past. But what this bill would do if it became a law is that it would redefine, not necessarily ATDS, but it would bring in another term called a robocall. And so it would define robocall as meaning an ATDS, as we're currently defining it, as the Supreme Court defined it in Facebook versus Duguid, but also any dialing system that dials without substantial human intervention. And, that's a term that goes back to that 2015 order. What does substantial human intervention mean? Does that mean if you are clicking to dial, that is enough substantial human intervention? If you have, for instance, a clicker agent type of dialing platform where you have one agent that's clicking hundreds of times to distribute calls a lot like a predictive dialer would, is that enough human intervention? And so the proposed bill does not currently provide any guidance around that. I know that there are several industry groups that are involved in this, the Bankers Association, the Chamber of Commerce, I think ACA is with them, but a number of different groups are approaching approaching Representative Pallone, and I'm sure will testify in the committee once that comes up for a hearing. But yeah, it's problematic, and that would take us back to looking at dialers and determining if it's enough human intervention and whether a click to dial will satisfy that it's not a robocall because it's got enough human intervention will be the next question that's asked, if that does pass.
Makes sense, and helpful to understand kind of what might come further there in terms of changes. I think one of the ways, a number of the questions, and one of the ways I think people are trying to consider this and understand is like, if I, as a lead, a lead caller, so someone who's actually reaching out to the consumer, is it a good strategy to simply try to take the position that, I'm not using an ATDS, and can that stand on its own as my compliance strategy? And if I do that, then do I not need to worry about one-to-one consent? And in fact, if I do that, do I not need to worry about express written consent at all? I just don't need consent because I can claim I'm not an ATDS and stand behind that as a, as a strategy for compliance? Or do I need to be kind of coupling the ATDS argument along with also having consent and having multiple kind of legs to stand on there, given some of the complexity with how the definition's evolving, and also maybe the complexity with how, with the other steps you would need to take at the state level for compliance or DNC checks. So how do you think about that dynamic?
When you're thinking about telemarketing campaigns, there's several different issues that you have to analyze. We've already talked about the ATDS, or pre-recorded message issue, which requires prior express written consent, one-to-one consent, logically and topically related to the website. But then also you have to look at do not call. And so even if we are not using an ATDS, we're not using a pre-recorded message, there still are these do not call requirements for telemarketing calls. So in order to place a telephone call without having to scrub against the state and federal do not call list, you have to have basically a consent to do that, a prior express invitation that does also need to be signed, like prior express written consent. And we can talk about that in a little bit. We'll just kind of bookmark that for a minute. But in order to get that prior invitation to call, the AGs, when they were looking at the FCC's order and were asked to provide comment to it, provided a comment that said, even for do not call, you probably need one-to-one consent because it talks about getting consent from the consumer to the seller. Now, I think, again, this is an area where you definitely need to consult with your attorney and have a defendable position set up, because I think that plaintiffs' attorneys will start arguing that you do need to specifically identify the seller for the consumer and the consumer select them in order to have do not call consent. But I think that's a little too far. And the FCC did say very specifically in the recent FCC order that they were not changing the requirements for consent to call somebody on the do not call list. And so when we do that do not call analysis, we first look to see if we need to have consent. And so the first kind of question you ask is, do I have an established business relationship exemption that you can either have because you've engaged in some type of business transaction with them in the last 18 months, or that consumer made an inquiry within the last 3 months. And so if you have either one of those, you don't need consent on the federal level. If you don't, then you would need consent from the seller to from the consumer to the seller in order to not have to scrub against the do not call list. I would again also say you've got to look at the state laws. There are a handful of states that don't have an EBR exemption, or they have one that is a shorter time frame than the federal EBR exemption.
That makes sense. And tell me if this is like a overly simplistic way to think about current state and future state. Like, get me honest on this statement, but if I were to say like every situation today where in the industry we expect express written consent, so where the buyer of a lead or the company that's ultimately calling the consumer expects to have express written consent, current state, in the future, those are the situations where it should go to one-to-one consent in order to remain compliant. Is that a shortcut to thinking about what we need to change here, or am I overly simplifying it to say it that way?
If you again, so are you using a pre-recorded message? Are you using an ATDS, one-to-one consent required for those? For do not call, I think there's a little bit more latitude around that. We don't have specific language in the FCC order that goes as far as it did for the ATDS and pre-recorded message, because as you recall, they only gave 2 examples of how you could get that one-to-one consent, other than just having one seller or one brand on that lead form. And that was, you could have a list of sellers that the consumer could proactively check the individual sellers that they were providing consent to. So that was one example. The other was that the lead form could direct the consumer to a brand specific web page. And so, if you did that, then obviously you're going to a web page that's branded only for that seller, and that's going to meet that one-to-one requirement. Did I answer your question, Eli? I think there were several parts to it. I think I got probably the first part of that. What was the second?
No, I think so. Yeah, I'm just thinking about how, in our like the distinction that I guess the scenarios where you need consent aren't necessarily changing with the regulation. What's changing is the type of consent, or the distinction around needing one-to-one consent versus whether you need consent or not. If I'm understanding it correctly, like that dynamic isn't this is not intended to open it up and make it easier to operate without consent altogether. It's instead trying to put a further distinction on having one-to-one seller names called out in the express written consent. So I think that helps. One of the questions we got was
a flow chart, Bas. I'm happy to send this on to you and Eli, that goes through what type of consent you need for what types of calls, and then on the other side goes through that do not call analysis. So I think it makes it much easier to just kind of think about this in a step-by-step flow chart kind of way.
Perfect. Yeah, I think that would probably be helpful for us to share out maybe after this. It's good guidance and refresher for everyone. One of the questions we got, I think, was referencing back to the third webinar where we had Royal United Mortgage describing kind of their dialing process and manual dialer, and there was a question about kind of what they're using. Bas, do you want to elaborate on that one?
Yeah, I think the particular question is, what dialer was Royal United Mortgage using that they were referencing when they were actually manually dialing. And I thought why it was such an interesting case to invite Royal United Mortgage in that particular session as well is because they don't use a dialer. They're actually typing in the phone number on their phone, 10-digit phone number, and they're dialing in that particular way. And what we're starting to see is a lot of discussions with the companies that are actually calling the leads to go into that route, to actually punching in the phone number and to ensure that they're not using any type of software and actually going back to manual dialing, like how it was, I don't know, the 1980s or beginning 1990s, which would not only satisfy the manual dialing, but in addition would actually create some more competition within the sales teams as well. So I am curious about that as an extension. So the answer is there's no dialer that's being used. Literally, like they are not using a dialer to make phone calls. They're actually typing in the phone numbers. I think an interesting add-on question to that, Michelle, is for what time if you actually collect such opt-in from a consumer and that is the process that you're deciding to go after, for how long can you contact consumers if you go that particular route, if you're following all state and national regulations?
Yeah, so there are some states that do limit the length of time that consent is good. So you definitely want to check that. But on the federal level, consent is good until it's revoked. And so there really is no specific time period on the federal level. Florida is one of those states that has a restriction on how long you can have those, how long consents will last. But I would say, there's what the law requires, and then there's the taking the appropriate steps to make sure you're not engaging in patterns or practices that are going to cause consumers to complain, because that really ultimately is what leads to the issues, especially with the regulators. And so if a consumer gave consent years ago, chances of them remembering are probably very small. I think most of the clients that I talk to have said, after 30 days, they stop calling on a lot of those leads because they find that those become the problematic leads, and they're not going to make a sale after, having called within that time period. So, again, the consent is good until it's revoked, except in a few states.
Okay, let's switch it up, because in the last conversation that we had, Royal United actually explaining their particular strategy, we also had I would say the opposite strategy, which was represented by ADT, which stated they would definitely take a more conservative approach going into 2025, wanting to ensure that there is a one-to-one or brand explicit consent that is available on each opt-in. So I think it's important that we spend a little bit of time on the how on that. There's been a lot of questions on how companies can actually obtain such a one-to-one consent, and in the regulations, the companies, the callers, the advertisers, how we refer to it in the industry, is being referenced as sellers. So maybe it's good to actually stick with the word sellers in this particular session, because the sellers are the ones that are selling their product to the consumer on the phone. And there's a lot of questions. So if a company will require their partnerships to obtain a one-to-one consent, how would that play out if the company is either, one, using a lot of different brand names, two, being represented by other company names? So think about captive agents that are calling on behalf of an insurance carrier or closing the insurance carrier's policy, but their agency name has a different company name, or even companies that are scheduling appointments on behalf of other companies. So there's a lot of unclarity on what is the actual seller name that needs to be present at the time of the actual opt-in. Can you share a little bit like your point of view on that, Michelle, and the different scenarios that I outlined there?
Yeah, so I mean, the simplest answer and the safest answer is the seller is the one that's ultimately going to have the product or service that's being sold. And so a telemarketer can call on behalf of a seller, and that doesn't change that analysis that the consent has been obtained for the seller to call, and a telemarketer is calling on their behalf. I think once you start looking at names that don't match the name on the lead form who's calling, then you start running into areas where there is risk. Because ultimately, if you think about how this plays out, what you're going to have is you're going to have a consumer complaining about, or more likely a class action plaintiff's attorney, complaining that the consumer never gave consent to this specific seller. And unless that business or whoever placed the call can pull a consent form that shows that they had the prior express written consent for the pre-recorded or ATDS call, then they're not going to have a very good defendable position, if at all. So really, the consent form has got to match who that ultimate seller is and who they're identifying themselves as on the phone. And so it gets, I think, a little bit more complicated. It's going to be interesting to see how the insurance cases play out. I know that the insurance companies are taking a very conservative approach on this, and they are requiring that their name be on the lead form, or at least a lot that I've talked to are requiring that their name be on the lead form, even for independent agents and captive agents as well. So, I think even more so than the law, who the agents are working for is going to dictate what those lead forms have got to say. So, we look at the law and then we look at what we're actually going to be able to sell as far as leads to various companies, and those have got to align.
And in practice, Michelle, how would that work? So if it's an agent's name and the carrier, would they be able to be combined, where, to your point, where a consumer can give consent to the particular seller's name, but if there needs to be multiple companies, there needs to be an affirmative action being taken by the consumer, which means a checkbox needs to be checked in all scenarios where the consumer would actually select those multiple companies. So in that case, do you think there's ways where the agency name and the carrier name could be selected at once, or would those actually be separate companies that would need to be selected at that point?
It's a great question, right? So I think that a lot of the times the agents are getting these the consent forms. A lot of times it's the agents that could be selling on behalf of multiple insurance companies. I think the safest way they can do that is to get consent for themselves to call on behalf of those multiple carriers. The FCC went through this scenario of comparison websites. And so if we're thinking about comparison websites for insurance companies, they said, we're not making this overly difficult for small businesses. I'm paraphrasing, but that's what they said. They said it will increase their the degree of complexity, but if they have multiple sellers that they could be selling to, then what they need to do is list each of those sellers on the lead form and let the consumer choose. So they took a pretty narrow approach to that. This is an area where I would definitely recommend that you get a legal opinion on what those lead forms need to look like in order to have effective prior express written consent. And again, that's for pre-recorded messages or if you're using an ATDS. If we're looking at do not call, I think there's a little bit more leniency around that. Maybe don't need to have the individual checkbox, but they should probably be identified on the lead form.
All right. Well, let me transition us to another category if we're good on this one for now. We received a number of questions surrounding how to think about calls. So I think a couple different categories of call marketing to consider here. So one scenario would be a warm transfer that an end brand seller is receiving or buying, right? And in that scenario, it could be the case that a consumer filled out a form, gave consent to be contacted, received a phone call from a lead generation company who got the consumer on the phone, and then got permission live on the call to transfer them over to an agent or to a representative from the end buyer brand that's going to be selling them the product. That would be one scenario. And in that case, like thinking about where consent has to occur, if it has to happen on the original website where the consumer's filling out the form, or can it also happen live during the conversation with the lead gen company gathering consent to transfer them over? And then I guess not only transferring them over, but also can the lead gen company get that person on the phone, get consent on the call for that other company to call them back. So call verify the lead live with their agent, and then sell it as a data lead to the brand after getting verbal consent for the brand to call them back from the consumer. Those are two scenarios. And then maybe the third would be just a direct inbound call where the consumer calls into the brand directly into their call center, and the brand might want to get consent while they're on the phone with that person to call them back on subsequent calls for telemarketing purposes. So can we think through those three and how we should be considering those with this?
But the easy one. So the easy one is the inbound call. So if a consumer is calling into whoever they're calling into, an insurance agency, a lead generation company, whoever they're calling into, if that's an inbound call that's initiated that connection, or that conversation to get consent to make an additional call, then we're fine, because you don't need consent for inbound calls, and you can obtain prior express written consent over the telephone. It was actually one of the first instances where the FCC talked about e-sign, And because we are getting an electronic signature on this prior express written consent, we have to comply with e-sign, which does require you to make certain disclosures. So make sure your script is right for obtaining that consent. But consumer calls in, you give the disclosures, you obtain consent. You could do that for multiple sellers in that situation, ask the consumer to individually consent to those. And then the call could be transferred, or that consent recording could be provided to those companies to make their own outbound calls.
Got it. So that's in the inbound scenario where the consumer initiates the original call.
Let me clarify. I want to make sure I was clear there. So if that call is then being transferred, just straight transferred from that inbound call, you're okay there too, because the consumer isn't, as long as the consumer is not receiving an outbound call, because, you know, to answer all of these questions, it's the outbound call that is requiring the prior express written consent. And specifically, it's the outbound call using an ATDS or pre-recorded message. So inbound being transferred to another is fine. But if it's an inbound and it's not being transferred, a subsequent outbound call is going to be made. You've got to get that prior express written consent through the voice recording.
Okay, that makes sense. And then is the same, should we think about it the same way if it starts with an outbound call? So if I go fill out a form and I give consent to be contacted by a lead generation company who's following up directly with me, then I get on the phone with them, and live on the phone, they gather consent from me to have someone else follow up with me, but I didn't call them originally. They called me, but they had consent to do it. Is that scenario also kind of under the same lens? Is that acceptable, we think?
This is an outbound call being made by a lead generator, and the purpose of that telephone call is to get consent for a warm transfer. So to make that outbound call, you have to have the consent of the seller. The lead generator is not the seller. The seller is the company that it's going to be transferred to. So in that scenario, you need consent from the seller in order to be able to transfer that call, I would say. If you don't have consent for the ultimate seller, then a tremendous amount of risk is introduced into that scenario. Again, ATDS, pre-recorded message.
Okay. I think that's an important distinction and nuance for everyone to understand and I think work through, because that, if I'm understanding that correctly, that means the original consent the consumer's providing on the website has to include the end seller's name, right, as a part of that, even if the first outbound call is actually going to come from a lead generation company who will transfer them to that seller. The name should be included from the original consent on the site, not only verbally discussed live over the phone in that scenario. Is that?
You're assuming in that situation, Eli, that lead generation company has gotten some type of consent to make that telephone call. So,
yep.
You know, there has to be, and again, I just want to make sure that we've got to distinguish between do not call and the other types of methods. And I think a lot of times those kind of all get sucked up into one. And so, you know, you can make those telephone calls if you're complying with the do not call requirements and not using the restricted technology. So just want to be really clear with that. And that's why it's really important to understand, you know, what these individual requirements actually apply to. And again, you know, I pointed out there's some commentary in the FCC's order that talks about getting consent for a specific seller. I think that the distinction there, the getting consent for the specific seller for do not call purposes, is that, you know, likely that's not the one-to-one consent you need for the restricted technology. And so really need to analyze those and make sure that you understand for each leg of that call what is required.
Really interesting. I have two follow-up questions to go a little bit deeper on this side, Michelle. One is around the time you actually call the consumer request, the lead, and that's really in relation to what the industry calls an H lead, or a lead that you follow up at a later stage, right? Not as a real-time inquiry within seconds, but could be in days, could be later. There's a lot of questions that are coming in, and that came in previously as well, around how to treat it if a lead is, let's say, a couple days old. If I'm actually focusing on leads that are a couple days old, is it fair to state that there's no difference in the way how you should be treating the call, regardless if it's real time or if it's, you know, days or for that matter weeks old? Like to your point, it depends if you use an ATDS or a pre-recorded message, and then how you navigate through DNC and state regulations. Is that really how to think about it? That a real-time lead should be treated the same way as an age lead in that regard?
The legal answer to that, the lawyer says that there is no distinction. As long as they haven't revoked their consent, there is no distinction. But the practical aspect of that, if you are dialing on aged leads, the chances of you getting complaints, the chances of those consumers who receive those calls complaining to the FCC, state AGs is very high. So legally, no. For practical purposes, yes, you should treat you should expect that aged leads are going to cause much more problems.
Hence why DNC practices are actually being enforced much more on calling out strategies. And separate question around that, there's a couple of questions around texting or SMSing coming in as well. We didn't really talk a lot about it in the beginning, but is how to think about texting leads, just to make sure that that topic is also addressed.
Yeah. So, I almost don't even look at the legal requirements for texting anymore. Probably not the best way to answer that question, but it's because, the CTIA best practices have been implemented by the texting and SMS carriers. And what I mean by that is for those campaigns, they will not allow you to use their platforms unless you first register with the campaign registry, which requires you provide information about your company and those that you're sending texts on behalf of, if you are. And then all of my clients and folks that I have talked to have said that the carriers are no longer carrying traffic for text and SMS unless you have consent, including for charitable calls. Very large national charity I work with is now having trouble with texting campaigns because even though they can reach their donors, if they don't have consent for those text messages, they're having a lot of trouble with the platforms getting their calls through. So I want to be really, careful and set up the right expectation that in this area, you can be right legally all day long and still not be able to get your texts out. So go in wide open, eyes wide open with that type of situation. But, for texts and SMS, really we're worried about whether it's an automatic telephone dialing system. If you're not randomly or sequentially generating the telephone numbers, you wouldn't need prior express written consent. If you're not using a pre-recorded voice in that text, you wouldn't need that. So we'd be looking at do not call. That text message is treated the exact same way as a call for do not call purposes. And we've discussed what that requires.
All right, well, let's see if we can knock off a couple more maybe related to the impact of the regulation here before we wrap up. One of them, and I think this is hopefully a quick one. Someone was asking who's liable in the event that the consumer is contacted and then complains. Is it the publisher? Is it the advertiser? Is it both? I think on this one, is it fair for us to say the company doing the calling is the company that's liable?
They're liable under the statute, but then also there's vicarious liability. So there's a couple different theories of vicarious liability, but basically it comes down to if they knew or should have known they were dialing in violation of the law, then there could be a ratification argument there that imposes vicarious liability. There's also, if they're acting as an agent, there can be vicarious liability. But for sure, whoever's actually physically committing that act of making the call or the text, they're liable, and then vicarious liability potentially for sellers or others involved. I just wanted to mention something because it's something that just recently passed. And so this is kind of breaking news on the state level. We've all heard about the reassigned number database. And so the reassigned number database came about because numbers are frequently reassigned, especially in the debt collection space. And so the carriers have put together a database that lets callers know that a number's been reassigned. If a number's reassigned, they had consent for who that number used to belong to, but not who it was reassigned to. And so Maine has just passed legislation that will go into effect in July that says that you are now required to scrub against the reassigned number database prior to making a telephone call, or that in and of itself is a violation. I am concerned that that will become a requirement for other states when, working with FCC or carrier around the reassigned number database. It was always thought that it would be an optional thing, a best practice, but optional. But now I think we'll see a trend of states requiring that. who knows, maybe the FCC at some point too, but just something to get out there. And, Eli, I have seen some plugs out there for platforms like Janaya in some of these comments that are coming out and the reports and orders that are coming out from the regulator specifically, touting that as a best practice for how you can prove that you have the kind of consent that you need. So whoever your lobbyists are, they're doing a very good job getting your names in there. But I think it's worthwhile pointing that out. It's really the easiest way to establish consent, or not having consent if the form's wrong, because you have validation that everyone is wrong. But for those that are doing it right, it's an excellent tool.
Helpful to hear that, helpful validation. That's certainly the role we're trying to play, is to be there as a neutral party to witness what occurred and help everyone make sure expectations are being met. Another question related to impact came in around, like, if we see the industry shift to this one-to-one consent model where the end brand or the seller, as defined by the regulation, where multiple sellers or brands are being presented to the consumer during the flow of the lead, like what's to stop the consumer from seeing those brands and just leaving the lead gen experience and going directly to those companies' websites? And so interested in that one, Bas. I don't know if you have a take on it. I've got some thoughts on kind of how that might evolve, but I'll put it out there first in case you have any thoughts on it.
I think it doesn't. It allows actually the consumer to do so. If they see a name being listed, and let's say they see Allstate being listed, they can go to allstate.com and continue their shopping experience there. But they can also do that today. Obviously, today I think with the company list that's within the TCPA disclosure that's used by most companies, companies are being listed in there, so you can also see which companies you could be listed to. I think what we've seen is there's been a shift in various different verticals where the company name is listed in the disclosure itself. So in the actual disclosure, under or mostly above the submit button, where the consumer can see they're being matched to company X. So in that regard, it's somewhat similar. However, in this case, if obviously there's multiple selections that the consumer is being provided with, or multiple options, I think it's a little bit more front and center. And for that matter, I think it's super important that in particular publishers are also starting to think about testing what the implications are of some of the flows that we all think one-to-one or brand explicit consent would look like. In our previous session, we went through all the flows that most companies believe will be implemented if we're looking for a one-to-one consent. But it's key, I think, going into Q2, Q3 of this year, to start testing, to actually start knowing what the implications are on conversion rates, on potentially on the impact on contact rates, because that should be very beneficial as well for the companies that are dialing on the data. We've seen from our end a couple of companies that are taking the charge on this, mostly the companies that want to call on the data, mostly wanting to make sure that next year, if they choose to go the one-to-one consent route, they already are building the database that is one-to-one consent compliant. But I think as an industry, we need to definitely, going into the next summer months, do a lot of testing. I'm curious, Eli, if you've seen any companies that are already proactively inquiring about, what the impact is on a Janaya lead ID script, for that matter, or actually sharing, different flows that we discussed previously. Do you see companies actively starting to test today?
Yeah, so we've seen companies exploring and trying to understand the options, looking at in some cases like mock-ups for new lead gen flows on their site, or new ways to approach generating the lead, and asking questions about how to prepare, but not a ton of direct live in production testing yet at this point. And I think it's an area where we're probably all going to need to accelerate in the coming months here to make sure we're getting into like live testing scenarios, because it's not that far off. The end of the year is going to approach pretty quickly. So hoping to see more of that over the next couple of months here. And we're also going to be ramping up our own product development efforts to make sure we're fully prepared to, to help our customers comply with all the changes here. So I think it's going to be a race to the end of 2024 with a lot of companies, finally getting fully educated on what these changes mean, and hopefully picking up the pace on starting to actually test and prepare.
100% agreed. Yeah. Michelle, if you would need to make a couple of predictions, like let's say we're past January 25th, there's a lot of questions around the potential impact where we're going to be next year. If you would just go through a couple of predictions from your end, what would they be being in 2025?
So I think that we'll see a lot less pre-recorded messages for reputable brands, as they're concerned about whether they have the right kind of consent to call on those. So that's what the FCC was trying to accomplish: reduce pre-recorded artificial voice calls. I think that's probably it's definitely one of the impacts that we're going to see on this. I also think that we are going to see litigation around e-sign, and whether appropriate e-sign has been followed the appropriate e-sign process to be able to obtain consent in a written form that's signed. So you're going to want to pay attention to that. I also think that just in general, we're going to see a lot more TCPA litigation out there. So, the advice that Eli was just giving and that you've been talking about, Bas, it's just so critical to be prepared for this now. So let the plaintiffs' attorneys go in after the low-hanging fruit, and don't give them a reason to want to put you in their crosshairs.
Bas, you want to give us your predictions?
Oh, Lord, I should have come back to Michelle so you didn't ask me the same question. Smart one, Eli.
No, you didn't talk fast enough, Bas. You might want to predict there's going to be legislation passed. That would be a good one. It seems to be happening.
I agree with all the points that you made, Michelle. I think to add from our point of view, obviously, we're all here because we feel that it's important to not only be educating, but also to work on our products in the market to be ready for this. So similar to Verisk PX is working on the different flows that we've laid out to make sure that we can support our clients that want to have one-to-one consent. That's definitely a big commitment that we're making. So I think number one, we're going to see companies that are going to be conservative, that are going to require one-to-one consent. I think a lot of people are still in denial around that, but we already have quite some confirmations around that. But on the other side, I think a lot of other companies are going to shift to manual dialing, and they feel that if they're navigating the legislation and the regulations properly, they will be in the clear. And at the end, either if you have one-to-one consent or if you are manually dialing, if there is a court case that's being brought or threat of a TCPA lawsuit, what I think industry standard is that a lot of companies want to settle right away. So it's hard to actually wanting to prove that you were manual dialing or auto dialing. So it's going to be interesting to see what's going to happen with the uptick in cases, if that's going to be the case. I think three, there's going to be a shift to more calls. We've already seen that in Medicare, where Medicare historically was very focused on warm transfers, and in the last year that shifted way more towards inbound. And as an industry, I think many companies did make that shift. And the last one, outside of the ways how most lead generation efforts are being executed on today with generic vertical lead forms, we see a huge shift already with branded, and a much higher demand on wanting to have a fully branded experience where the consumer lands on a landing page, and from the start, that during that process, it is clear what the seller is. It's even clear what their product is. It's clear that what you're opting in for, and that could be from the start of a landing page or even on the creative what the consumer is clicking on. And I think the companies that are well positioned for different flows of branded, that being email, top 10 websites, or even in a lead form where you do a link out as one of the scenarios that you laid out, Michelle, I think are going to be equipped pretty well to capture the shift in budgets that might tend to happen, which we've seen with companies like laid out by ADT in previous sessions as well. Eli, what do you think is going to happen?
Well, I think you hit the nail on the head there with the comment about like shifting, seeing things shift more towards consumer expectations being better defined on that original lead form. I'm optimistic that we're gonna actually see a shift towards more of that I think gets at the true intent of this regulation, even if a lot of the nuances of and the specifics of how it's been rolled out may be challenging and create a number of negative side effects in our industry. I think the intent is a good one, where the idea of consumers actually understanding what's going to happen after they submit their phone number and request to be contacted, having a better understanding of those expectations, and then having better compliance with the next steps that occur after that is ultimately a good thing for the consumer experience and for our industry to be able to stick to that and to the truth of what someone is trying to have happen when they fill out a form and request to be contacted. So I'm optimistic we'll see more of that and less of the kind of generic submission of data and reselling of leads without clear expectations for the consumer. And then maybe I'd add, for as we see this shift towards more one-to-one brand-specific, seller-specific consent, we're certainly betting on and preparing for all of the end buyers to want to be able to confirm that their name was presented to the consumer and that the consumer opted in and gave consent for their specific brand to receive their data and receive calls. So preparing for a future where everyone needs to verify that fact before taking the lead and starting to contact it, I think is going to be a big shift and something we all have to get ready to to adhere to in 2025.
I like that you referenced Eli, the optimistic outlook. You referenced like that this can take the industry to good things as well. We talked about that in the previous sessions, and without giving too much away, PX conducted a state of the industry report this year again, where we, as a preparation for LeadsCon, conducted a survey among many people. I believe we had over 600 people that joined within the survey, and one of the highlights that we'll actually discuss next week on Tuesday morning is the optimism, is actually that industry players are more optimistic about the industry than ever before, which I think is interesting to make this whole session full circle, because we started this session to make sure that we were going to only share the facts and just go in a very pragmatic way through all the details, which I think we've done. And I know that Michelle, you'll be at LeadsCon next week. Eli, you'll be at LeadsCon. You'll join the panel that I'm referencing as well to discuss these findings. PX will be having a big booth at 603 as the title sponsor. So I think a lot of topics next week and a lot of discussions will be about what 2025 is going to look like, and hopefully we have a chance to connect with all of you that attended. We got a lot of questions. I apologize for not being able to go through all the questions. I think we can have a fifth session potentially with more questions that we got in today. So we'll make sure that we address these on a one-to-one basis. But thank you so much again, Eli, for joining me on the session. Thank you so much, Michelle, for coming back and sharing all your knowledge on this topic, and looking forward to seeing everyone that will be there next week in Vegas.
Thank you all. Thanks, Michelle. Appreciate you letting us pepper you with questions and interrogate you here for everyone's benefit.
A bright light too. I'm not usually at home and I have a bright light here, so it did feel a little bit like that, I'll have to tell you. But thank you both for letting me join you. It was a lot of fun.
Awesome. Thank you so much, guys.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye-bye.